Smarter, Not Harder Rewind podcast. I'm Brittany Alligood.
And I'm Scott Holcomb.
And we're a part of the program accountability team in the Data Research and Accountability Department here at Wake County Public Schools. And so as the newest members of our team, we've been taking a look back at our earlier episodes to shine a light on how our department has been helping staff navigate the self-monitoring process.
And today kicks off the first part of our two-part Rewind series finale. We are rewinding an original idea from our colleagues that explores data visualization. We'll be looking at how to move beyond just numbers to find data stories we encounter in our work every day.
So like Scott just mentioned in our last episode, Crystal Cabral really emphasized that data is meant to tell a story and not just represent numbers. And so even during the wrap up of that episode, I mentioned that idea is one thing that really stuck with me, that visuals are really what make a story clear and meaningful for our audience.
Yes, exactly. So today we're taking on that next step. How do we use data visualization to make sure those stories are clear and meaningful rather than just getting lost in a spreadsheet?
Right. In today's episode, we're going to walk through 4 common data stories that we see in our work and then discuss what each one may look like in practice by sharing some real examples based on those conversations that we've been reflecting on throughout this season.
A lot of the content that we'll cover and language that we'll use today comes from a great book titled Effective Data Visualization by Stephanie Evergreen. Each chapter walks through a different type of data story and shows how to choose the right chart, often with examples coming from Excel.
Yes, and that Excel piece might give you a little preview of what we have planned for our next season coming this fall.
Yep, I'm looking forward to that. So for now, if you want to follow along or explore more in depth, we've put the book information in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely check it out. That's a great book. Highly recommend for anyone who's looking to get that information on data visualization. So jumping in here, let's start with the basics. What is data visualization? At its core, it's really about how we can use visuals like bar charts or line graphs to communicate what our data is actually saying. And the goal is ultimately to help our targeted audience to quickly understand the point and hopefully either build support or confidence in what our data is showing.
Yes, that's a great point. I think it's worth noting that not every piece of data needs a visualization or that all data visualizations are created equally. So if a visualization is confusing, poorly designed, or doesn't truly reflect the data story, it can actually backfire and make the information harder to understand than if we had just used a simple table.
Right. It's a very good point. I think having that clarity is definitely better than just having a decoration for a visualization just to have it.
Mm-hmm. To kick us off, let's start with a great clip from episode 5 with our colleague Megan Scrimger and Crystal Cabral that emphasizes why turning data into a story is such a vital part of our process.
How do you go about forming your data into a story or summarizing your data into meaningful information?
Yeah, so that's really, really important part of the process, isn't it? Because thinking about working in public education, the majority of our data is really people data points. So when we're looking at numbers, we're looking at little bits of someone's story, whether that's a teacher, a student, a classroom. And if we isolate it as purely a number, we lose the bigger picture of what that number represents.
I love that clip from this episode, and I especially like Crystal's point of not just looking at the numbers, but again, what those numbers actually represent.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of numbers, let's jump into our first type of data story, which is telling a story with a single number. And although on the surface, this seems like a really simple type of data, this one comes up more often than you might think, especially in our work.
Exactly. Sometimes you don't really need a complex chart. You just need one key number that captures the main point you want the audience to walk away with.
Right.
Maybe it's a percentage or a raw count. The goal is to help people quickly understand the so what of the information.
Exactly. So just to get a sense of how this may show up in our work, let's listen back to a couple of examples from our earlier episodes with program staff. First, starting with episode 2 with Sherry Miller.
We had data to show us, how many students were not reading proficiently. We had EOG data that was telling us where students were back in 2013, 2014.
And here's another one from episode 4 where Dr. Maria Rosa Rangel used a single number, family attendance, to measure the reach of her efforts.
We actually have a source of data points and different data sources that we collect. So for example, we collect attendance. We really want to know how many parents are attending the workshops that we offer at the different grade levels and at the different schools.
In both cases, that single number acts as a headline, whether it's the number of students proficient in reading or giving insight into family engagement. That one data point carries the weight of the entire story.
Right. Again, it seems very simple, but it can still be really powerful.
Yes. Building on the idea of telling a story with a single number, there are many times when we need to provide context in our work by comparing 2 or more data points. For example, a single test score tells one story, but comparing those scores between schools or different student groups tells a much richer one.
Yeah, these comparisons really can help us understand patterns and identify differences that may be important for decision making. Now let's listen back to episode 5 to hear how Crystal Cabral, who we heard from earlier, discuss how she encountered this type of data story in her work.
We find that most people tend to want to think on a macro level first. So, for example, if I'm meeting with an area superintendent, they want to know, how did my region do compared to the district? Or if I'm meeting with a principal, they want to know, how did my school do compared to the district or my region, right? So they want comparison data, but they want it to be macro level. And that's how we usually pull our data together, depending on the group we're presenting to. For our district leaders, they really could pull it up with every single school that uses STAR Math, so all our middle and elementaries on it. It's a little overwhelming to look at it that way. That's a whole lot of dots. But you can also filter it down by grade band. So what if I wanted to see every 6th grade across the district? Or I can drill into a particular school and also sort it by grade bands. And as you go further and further in thinking about that macro to micro level, we get more detailed information about how teachers might be interacting with students and how students are responding to instruction.
So as you heard in those 2 clips from Crystal, comparing numbers like this helps program staff to see those trends at both the big picture macro level and down to the individual school or grade level.
Yeah, and spotting those differences, that's very key and important in making decisions. It can help staff dig deeper into the story that the data is telling and be an effective way to answer questions like, where are there gaps? Which areas show consistent trends? Are there differences between schools or grades? Where do we need to focus various resources to improve student outcomes?
Yeah, all important questions that we encounter all the time. And like we mentioned in that previous episode, disaggregating by subgroups is a common practice in our district. So this is definitely a data story that we're very used to hearing. Moving on to our next data story, benchmarks go a step beyond comparisons and give us a reference point or a goal. That way we can see how close or how far we are to where we want to be. And one of the most common examples that came to mind that we see in our work is proficiency levels for end of grade testing, where we do have that set benchmark we're expecting, or our growth benchmarks that tell us whether scores are below, meeting, or exceeding growth.
And to help us understand how this works in practice, let's hear from Valinda Prince from episode 3. She'll talk about how benchmarks and baselines allow us to map our progress.
So you have to assess your current status, which means you have to collect your baseline data. And this allows you to begin to measure just how far you are from your desired outcome. And with these endpoints, your baseline data and desired outcome, you can begin to strategically map where you'll need to be at key points in order to productively meet your goals. So you really want to know, where do I need to be? Where are we trying to go? And again, you want to look at where you are. And if you have difficulty understanding where you need to be, then that's when you want to pull in resources and collaborate with folks who can help you determine where should we be at the end of our work. And If you need help with determining your baseline data, you need to pull in folks who are familiar with how to evaluate and process and assess, and what type of assessment tools might be helpful in determining where you are currently. And then you want to look at incremental steps along the way that will help you get from point A to point B with enough data points, and remembering to go back and monitor and evaluate, are we moving in a trajectory that represents where we're trying to go? And if not, what steps do we need to take now?
So as Valinda mentioned, benchmarks aren't just about where you are. They're really about understanding the distance between where you are now and where you want to be. They're not just static numbers. They help us monitor if our efforts are actually moving the needle.
Right. And the last data story that we'll cover today is when there are parts of a whole. And we often encounter this when our data is adding up to 100%.
Yeah, and this would come up when we're talking about proportions or breaking a group into components. Mm-hmm. So in our work, this is often things like student demographics or like the racial breakdown of a specific program to see who is being served.
Exactly. So now let's listen back to a clip from episode 2 where our former colleague Andy Jackal shared an example from his interview with Sherry Miller about using student group data within her logic model.
But the thing I wanted to emphasize a lot is the use of data. You can have a map and a compass and a GPS, but it really all comes down to data to know where you are and where you want to go. And I love the way that your logic model listed very specific with the need, EOG scores, subgroup disaggregation. You were very clear about the need and also what you hope to achieve and on what timeline.
So in that example with Sherry Miller, you can hear how breaking the data into those smaller groups can help you better understand that fuller picture. Instead of just looking at that one number, you can see how each subgroup performed and how they compare within that whole set of students that you're looking at.
And we also use this story when we look at survey responses a lot of times. If you're looking at a Likert scale where we're looking at what proportion of our staff or parents strongly agree versus disagree on a specific item. Mm-hmm. And that actually serves as a perfect spoiler for our next episode, where we'll take a deep dive into how to make survey data tell a meaningful story.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into those data stories next time.
And to recap, so today we've explored 4 ways to tell a data story using a single number, comparisons to spot patterns. Third one being benchmarks as a map towards a goal, and parts of a whole. The goal of these visuals is clarity, helping your audience quickly understand the so what of the information. So Brittany, reflecting on these 4 types of data stories we covered in this episode, what stood out to you the most?
I think one thing that comes to mind is not discounting those simple types of data stories that we have and how powerful, even whether it's just a single number or just a comparison between groups, it may seem simple in the realm of all types of data or research statistics that we could be looking at. But I think, again, those small, simple ways to look at data and tell a story can be really powerful, especially in terms of decision making. So what is something that stood out for you, Scott?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One being one of our earlier points that not every number that you or data point that you collect requires a visual. I think that's something important, And then also using when you're telling that story, using the data to get you from point A to point B. So those benchmarks, even in those comparisons, you see it come up. Just using them to help tell the story to reach a goal.
Right. Yeah. It's all great points.
Mm-hmm. So what can our listeners look forward to in the second part of this discussion and our final Rewind season episode?
The next episode is going to kick off again our second part of our Rewind on data visualization and the final episode for our Rewind series. So like we've said earlier, we're going to be covering 4 more types of data storytelling in our work with a look back of examples from our previous Rewind interviews. So look forward to hearing 4 more types of data stories.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thanks to the guests from the episodes we highlighted in this rewind and all the former and current DRA colleagues who facilitated those interviews.
Thank you to our talented producer, Daniel Bunce, and to my co-host, Scott Holcomb.
And thank you to WCPSS student Sasha Wilson from Millbrook High School for providing our theme music for this season.